All right, next week we got a couple of really interesting things going on. Number one, we are watching Blonde, the NC-17 biopic starring, I believe, Anna de Armas. Is that right?
Ana de Armas, yes, that is
And
correct.
as Marilyn Monroe, it's a story we've wanted to explore for some time in our culture. And it's interesting we would get a Marilyn Monroe movie right after Elvis. These are people who have kind of faded out of the zeitgeist, and it'll be interesting to see them return. The other thing is we're going to do a little bit more Bollywood Virgins watch. We're watching Kal Ho Na Ho, which I know very little about. Um, should you prepare me for it, or should I go into it blind?
Um, well, I think the basic summary of it is it's sort of it's a bit tragic in terms of some of how the story plays out. It is a love triangle involving the three actors you can see on screen here. Um, the lead character, basically, I think who the movie revolves around is the one in the white shirt, played
Hmm.
by who I would say is probably the most iconic Bollywood actor today and of all time, and Shah Rukh Khan, and he is the one who kind of grounds this story from beginning to end. The movie for the I think I'm pretty sure if I remember it correctly because I haven't seen it in some time. The vast majority of it, like a good 90% of the movie, takes place in New York City and mostly in Brooklyn.
Wow.
So for a movie that came out, I believe in 2001 or 2002, so really in just the immediate post 9/11 era, Bollywood movies are usually produced for a lot less money because the cost of living and everything else in India is a lot lower than in the US. But for them to come out to the US with all the cast and crew, and then I'm sure they hired people locally, it was obviously an expensive production.
Hmm.
But it was worth it because the movie, was a huge hit. And as Bollywood movies are known, they're known um, for being like uh, these fully fleshed out productions where the actors can act, they can dance. I mean, they don't really
They're
sing, you know,
spectacles. They
they're
don't sing in this
spectacle.
one?
It's huh?
They don't sing in this movie?
They do their songs, but I'm just
Okay.
in Bollywood movies there's always backup singers who usually are doing the singing, and so the actors are just kind of like it's just lip syncing essentially.
Hmm.
What I like about this movie, it's sort of not only is it a story that takes place. Obviously, it's a Bollywood movie that's takes place entirely, or like I said, almost entirely within the context of the U.S. And then it goes into a lot of like cultural like identity things, commentary, and more explores like how do these people identify uh, with the culture that they're growing, like the young people in the movie are growing up in, and the old people who spent the majority and the battery died. This happened last week too, by the way, where we got to the last segment and my battery died. Anyway, but you get a lot of that cultural identity commentary in here. People who grew up in India and then when moved to the U.S. and how do they connect, and how do they embrace their culture, or do they assimilate to the American identity? And that's part of it. But then there's also the love triangle. That's how I would describe it.
It sounds like a compelling story. I mean, like you said, it's interesting that a Bollywood movie would even try to shoot in New York. That's different. So I'll look forward to watching that. And then Blonde has had a lot of sort of intrigue around it. It's I don't know where has Marilyn Monroe been in our culture? She used to be sort of this idol and this icon. Women kind of wanted to be her, men wanted her. It was like, and she was this touchstone of culture that everybody knew. And it's like now we're living in a world where she hasn't been relevant for 30, 40, 50 years maybe. Not many people our age and younger know her story, know her relevance. Um, and so it's interesting to even consider that like it's a story still worth telling. Um, as we progress through time, it'll be interesting to see what happens to legends that mattered to the generation before us. And we'll see who gets remembered and whose legacies last. And if there's a reason for it, we've been tied to culture for a long time because we've been able to make a record of it for, a solid record of it for the last 100 years. But if we think back to the last 200 or 300 years, we have history books and we have novels and letters and some artifacts. But it'll be interesting to see just how disposable or not disposable the classic greats of the last generation were.
Yeah, and then I think the big conversation piece around this movie in particular is not only obviously, we're going back and living through the life of Marilyn Monroe. This is an NC-17 movie. And
Yeah.
it seems like from a lot of the reviews, the movie like earns that NC-17 rating by
Oh,
really
good.
showing you like the brutality of like what Marilyn Monroe experienced of coming up through Hollywood and what she had to do to at a time when misogynistic men ruled the roost basically everywhere. Some will say not much has changed since, but hopefully
We'll see.
I would like to think that we have made some progress. But I think that while some people have taken that and said that okay, well we're depicting what happened, fair enough. Other people are like, why do we have to go into such graphic nature? Like why do we have like why can't we obviously like yes, we know what happened, and as long as we're aware of those facts, great. Why shouldn't we focus a little bit more on just how good of an actress she was, like for her talent, more
She
so
wasn't
than
a great
just
actress.
no, no, I'm not saying she wasn't,
But
no, I mean, she wasn't the
here's
best actor of her time. I just think like a lot of people are sort of looking at it and saying this movie focuses on her as a victim so much, but while I think they would have liked to see a bit more of a balance where between seeing her as the victim of a lot of bad things, which totally that's what happened, and nobody's denying that, but maybe showcase the other side of her career where when she was
well,
on screen and the success
yeah.
that she enjoyed.
This I mean, depending on just how graphic and what tack they take with the story, this could undo the legacy, or it could totally change what she stands for in society. And that's almost more concerning that like we can rewrite somebody's life once they're gone to serve a purpose in modern society where their existence doesn't make sense. You know, she was a product of her time, and to place her story within the context of our time is anachronistic, number one, but it's also like, what are we really going to hold her to the standards of today? It's not a fair
No,
way of telling the story.
I think the same
So,
thing, like you mentioned earlier, would have applied to Elvis, right? It's
absolutely.
kind of it's hard to make that comparison because even Elvis, I mean, even if he held up Elvis as being like the victim of a lot of, the colonel took advantage of him and Elvis always wanted to do right, you could still go and have a conversation with Elvis, the person, and the standards to which we hold ourselves today. In a lot of ways, Elvis would have seemed very antiquated. Is that the word? I'm sorry,
Antiquated.
I'm
Yeah.
antiquated.
Well,
Antiquated. I mean, it's hard to kind of like we tend to think like for example, I think a lot of people would have a very hard time having a easy conversation with John Wayne today. I mean, he's not alive anymore, but like John Wayne grew up in a very different time. He had a different set
yeah.
of beliefs than what a lot of people would say are are acceptable today by today's social standards. But it's hard when we like make a movie about people like that, but then the movie has to almost be in line with our what is socially acceptable today, and then you kind of tread the line of what was historically accurate and
Yeah.
and
By the
what's
end,
socially acceptable.
also, like today, almost nothing is socially acceptable. So it's like, eh, I really, honestly, I look forward to the, decades from now when we get to make movies about now because the standards
Oh man, yeah.
the standards will either totally slingshot in the other direction, or they'll get much more stringent. And all of the good guys from today will get their stories retold, and they'll be the villains or the victims, and it'll be all wrong then.
Yeah,
I think it's
it's
really
weird
hard
because
to
then
trust your legacy
yeah.
with a director, you know, 4 decades after you're gone. More.
Yeah, I mean not to mention that Marilyn Monroe's not around to really sign off on any of this. She
No.
can't even go out and like if she felt wronged by something and speak for herself in her own defense, because well, she's not around. Like, with Elton John and when his biopic came out. I mean, there's upsides and downsides to that, because some people
Yeah.
then want to just keep their image as pristine and clean as
We
possible,
we
and
had
then
this
so
we had the problem with the Freddie Mercury biopic where all of the other members come out squeaky clean.
yes,
But at the same time, I enjoyed the Brian Wilson biopic, Love and Mercy, and he was involved in that, and he was consulted, and the actors spent a lot of time with him. And I think that's as close as you can really get. And if the actual person signs off on it, and you can show some of that truth, I mean, that's actually why I'm looking forward mostly to this Weird Al biopic, because he's deliberately turning it into a parody of biopics,
yes,
which
that's what I
and
loved
that's
about it, because that's what makes it like worth watching this, because it's not the same as every other biopic out there about some famous person that you admire.
but he's going in with the premise that, like, yeah, you shouldn't believe half of this stuff, and he's gonna act in it as not himself, and
Yeah,
it's
it's
gonna be off
hilarious.
the wall.
It's
We need
it's
something like
so
that.
him. It's
Yeah.
so him. It's like he's known for being meta and doing all this commentary, to the point that his own biopic is like a meta commentary of his own life.
Yeah,
That's the way you do meta. That if
I
there's any,
agree.
that's the right way to do meta.
I
Yeah.
agree, and that's coming from someone whose favorite movie is Walk Hard: The Dewey Cox Story, which is also a fake biopic. It's like it's important to call out the recurring tropes of really what is it? Fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to kind of quickly follow back up with Kalonaho. This movie, by the way, I think I was mentioning it earlier. It's like 20 years old almost at this point. So it's not necessarily like we talked about it, like, movies about a ton different time. It's like 20 years, a lot of things actually had changed. Like we were alive back then, but like it was a whole different
Yeah,
world. But before my camera battery died, I was kind of like going into the idea of it, this movie feels like it's like a time capsule of its own, of like some it's a very different kind of a feel than what you get from Bollywood movies today, because the way they're filmed, the kind of directors that are working in the industry today, kind of actors, and then what the social standards of Bollywood movie and what people in India like to see on screen today, it's different. And I think this movie kind of harkens back to a different time that, for me personally, I still look fondly back at these movies from, like, including this and many others from that era, like the late 90s, the early to mid 2000s, and it
yeah,
just was a different time. So, and to me, this movie felt like it's actually quite funny, but it is also very wholesome, but it is also, it takes some risks from a narrative standpoint, and you may see some melodrama in it, and you're like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this, but Bollywood always kind of like turns things up a couple of notches on that front.
yeah.
So as long as you have fun with it, I think what's gonna be nice is if, as somebody like, so I'm not a Bollywood virgin, but like you would be, and anybody else on the team who's going to be, like Roland, maybe Catriona, or might watch it. I think the fact that the majority of the movie takes place in the U.S. hopefully kind of helps ground it into maybe it will make it a little more approachable or relatable than.
Maybe, but I've been charmed by everything I've seen so far from Bollywood this year, and this year I really was a Bollywood virgin. Now I've seen a few movies, and I'm mostly a fan, I would say.
All right.
But you know what? Watch along with us. We're gonna watch Blonde. We're gonna watch Kal Ho Naho. The names never get easier for me. I will say that.
I mean,
But
this was a pretty simple name. There's like
I
one
know.
syllable per word.
I know. Well, what can I'm stupid. So that's the problem. Follow us on all the different things. Find us. We have our own website. You can read about us and do that whole thing. We're on Twitter, Twitch, Instagram. Follow us on Instagram and YouTube, and tell your friends. Become part of this conversation about this water we're swimming in. We haven't figured out why it's wet just yet. One of these days, maybe. But thank you
That's
for
a throwback.
watching. Oh yeah, it's been a year. It's been a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching, and have a wonderful week. Goodbye.